As the title on the screen asserts, my presentation will be about the biography of Cardinal Ludovico Ludovisi and its transcription. As an art historian of the early modern period, I have spent much time studying the noble families of Rome. Prior to this work, my research focused on the reception of Michelangelo and all things Michelangelesque, both in the centuries after his death and in the 20th century. This resulted in me focusing largely on the Barberini, a family that is rather, ironically, inimical to the Buoncompagni Ludovisi. However, like so many projects, this one was born out of some luck, for a chance inquiry with Dr. Brennan related to the Ludovisi led to a film screening of The Princess of Piombino for my Baroque class in the fall of 2019. Since then, a collaboration with Dr. Brennan has developed into this project, a most exciting opportunity for me to direct research toward the Ludovisi family and to incorporate an archival project into one of my art history classes that I teach at Kutztown University. The biography of Ludovico Ludovisi was written by Lucantonio Giunti sometime around 1633. It became a central piece of my spring 2020 art history seminar, a capstone type course that art history majors and minors are required to take before they finish their studies in art history. It is a class that is largely designed to give students a kind of methodological footing for future curatorial or academic work. They learn about theories and approaches to art history. So, in order to expand upon this knowledge, it has always been one of my goals to incorporate authentic assignments into the coursework of the class. Composing a review after visiting a gallery or museum exhibition was something I had assigned in the past as an example of this. But the opportunity to work with Dr. Brennan on a document from the Archivio Buoncompagni Ludovisi was an authentic assignment unlike any other. The information that I want to share with you today is both about the contents of the biography and the work that was done to transcribe it as a project of teaching using primary sources. So let's begin with some background information on the text with which we were working. Lucantonio Giunti's biography of Cardinal Ludovisi is a handwritten copy of the Cardinal's life in approximately 124 leaves. The text, as you can tell, is cursive and written largely in Italian, although there are Latin sections that transcribe documents such as the Cardinal's will and testament and his benefices. Giunti, from Urbino, was the private secretary of the Cardinal, and from the tone of his text, we can glean that he was proud of the man he worked for. Even if Giunti is at times self-deprecatory about his own work, referring to the biography in one instance as mal composti fogli, we have an author possessed with a sense of urgency. He even occasionally cuts himself off for the sake of brevity to write his pages and relay this important information. There are 3 known copies of the biography. One in the Biblioteca Corsini in Rome, that which is referenced by Ludwig Pastor and Francis Haskell in the History of the Popes and Patrons and Painters, respectively, which is possibly the original. Our copy from the Villa Aurora, and a third in the Biblioteca Vaticana that is bound with another biography, the life of Francesco della Rovere, the 6th Duke of Urbino. The Villa Aurora copy was digitized along with 150,000 other pages from the Archivio Buoncompagni Ludovisi after it was discovered by Her Highness Princess Rita Buoncompagni Ludovisi in July of 2010 amongst a previously undisturbed cache of documents in the Casino Aurora. This was a surprising discovery in part because the Ludovisi archive had already been donated to the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano in 1947 and has remained there since as the Fondo Archivio Boncompagni Ludovisi. The texts found by the princess represent a previously unknown group of documents that have not yet been systematically studied. Despite the short life of Cardinal Ludovisi, the contents of the biography span numerous topics. They include discussions of his personality and character, his work through the many churches, abbeys, and monasteries that he oversaw, along with his health, and his relationship with major political figures. Like most biographies, this one is arranged chronologically and begins with a discussion of the early years of Ludovico. The first 26 years of his life are condensed into just 15 pages. These lead up to his all-important elevation to the cardinalate in the year 1621. In these early pages, we learn of the central tenets of Ludovico's character. He was fair, modest, and smart, and he kept his word. He tirelessly held audiences and was punctual, we learn, in doing so. He zealously followed decrees from his uncle and was a man who gave good counsel to the cardinals, princes, and others who surrounded him. We learn early on of his mannerisms and of his dress. He spoke prudently and concisely. He dressed humbly but appropriately. And we also learn of his charity work. These pages bring us remarkably close to the man. Giunti's biography, furthermore, emphasizes important aspects of the life of a 17th century cardinal and cardinal nephew. We are well aware that this was a position of political and religious authority. The biography highlights these roles through the intersection of the cardinal's political and religious life. One way this comes through is via the various episodes in which Cardinal Ludwizi interacts with religious or political leaders. We learn of the various roles he took on in his uncle's papacy, for example, of his involvement with the coalition of the Catholic League, and of his filial devotion to the Capuchin monk, Girolamo de Narni, for whom he oversaw the safe interment of his mortal remains. We learn that the cardinal was overjoyed that his uncle's pontificate could be credited with receiving Heidelberg's famed Bibliotheca Palatina, as we have learned about today in Carlo Marino's talk. And we also experience through Giunti's eyes the Ludovisi connection to figures such as Marco Antonio de Dominis, the Archbishop of Split, a mathematician and prolific writer who succeeded in offending both Catholic and Protestant churches. Dominis had initially fled the Roman Inquisition, going to England, but when he was forced to return to Rome, he was supported by Gregory XV with a pension in the city. At the Pope's death, that support was lost, and he was imprisoned as a heretic in Castel San Angelo, where he died in 1624. Another example in the biography of the cardinal's political life is seen in the episodes that relate to his relationship with the Kingdom of Spain. The Ludovisi supported the Spanish, and the cardinal's allegiance to the Real Corona is affirmed by Giunti through diplomatic missions, such as when he hosted one of the king's ambassadors on a trip to Rome in 1629 and 1630. We also learn of his communications with Philip IV's prime minister, the Count Duke of Olivarez. A copy of a 1632 letter to the Duke is transcribed in the biography, which includes a donation to the Spanish crown of 100,000 scudi and the income of 9 abbeys. These diplomatic associations signaled the cardinal's allegiances and solidified his loyalties. Social status also plays an integral part of the biography. We see that Cardinal Ludwizi, although portrayed as modest or appropriately humble at times, is also shown to have had a full social calendar. One of the most entertaining sections of the biography is that which discusses his attendance at the wedding of Odoardo Farnese and Margherita de' Medici. Attending the wedding with Cardinal Aldobrandini, Giunti records the exciting event. We learn about the ceremony itself in the Florentine Duomo, of the wonderful reception held at Palazzo Pitti as well. It was there that a comedy with fantastic machines thrilled guests, and where the wedding festivities continued the day after with a hunt of ferocious animals and a battle with pistols between knights. Finally, banqueting, games, and dancing awaited the guests at Poggio a Caiano on the third day of celebrations. Ultimately, Giunti relates that the two cardinals stayed in Florence for some 20 days and were met with generous gifts from Duke Cosimo II de' Medici on their departure. It is a fascinating and entertaining section of the biography that sheds light on matrimonial customs, on the Medici, and of course on the affairs of a cardinal. Through the biography, we learn of the cardinal's artistic patronage as well. It does not take up an enormous amount of space in Giunti's accounts, but it seems a fitting representation of 17th century Roman society that art and architecture are cited throughout the biography. We learn of several important monuments and works of art. Among them are the painting in the Gesù of Gregory XV and Cardinal Ludovisi, and at the canonization of Saints Ignatius of Loyola and Francis Xavier. This anonymous painting is still in the sacristy of the same church. We learn of his purchases of villas and gardens, as in the acquisition of Villa Frascati from the Duke Altemps, and the purchase of the gardens at the Porta Pinciana in Rome, building on the land surrounding the Villa Aurora, and which, according to Giunti, was the più delizioso luogo che sia dentro le porte di Roma. We learn of his donation of silver torches, vases, gold and diamond cups, candelabras, crosses, silver angels, and other treasures to the Church of San Ignazio in Rome, of which Cardinal Ludovisi was the principal benefactor. Through Giunti, we even have a first-hand account of the fascinating construction project for San Ignazio, commissioned by the Cardinal, who, following the direction of his late uncle, broke ground in 1626. It was a project that took over 20 years to complete, as it was marred by flooding and other construction obstacles. We learn that our biographer Giunti himself did his part to help with the work, jumping in alongside Jesuit priests, secular gentlemen, and hired hands to help with the foundation's construction. Giunti reports on how Cardinal Ludovisi commissioned the great Bolognese artist Guido Reni to paint a Holy Trinity for the high altar of Santissima Trinità dei Pellegrini in Rome, a work that still hangs in this church to this day. And we also learn of the more intimate objects that Cardinal Ludovisi commissioned, as, for example, an ebony and ivory cross with the Virgin Mary and Christ on it, an object that he treasured so immensely it was supposedly buried with him. But it certainly was not all luxury for Cardinal Ludovisi. As has already been noted, the Cardinal died quite young, at just 37 years of age, and much of his biography is tied to recording his periodic bouts of illness that eventually led to his death. Ludovisi struggled with gout for much of his life, and unsurprisingly, the intensity of the attacks appeared to increase towards the end of it. Giunti cites numerous remedies the cardinal employed, ranging from visiting the baths of San Casciano in southern Tuscany to seeking medical attention from Florentine and Paduan doctors. Their advice is supremely interesting, if not for the light it sheds on medical practices and alleged cures in the 17th century. It is perhaps not surprising, given our own recent experience with disease, that doctors offered up rather contradictory information, some recommending to avoid alcohol, for example, while others championing its effects. In addition to gout, we learn about a toothache that the cardinal had treated with fiery iron, a carriage accident that befell his sister and brother-in-law due to a reckless driver, and the occasional threats of plague in the areas through and around which the cardinal traveled. The latter forcing him into the occasional quarantine, a situation with which, again, we are all now familiar. The biography is rich in these kinds of minor, sometimes anecdotal details that remind us of the difficulties and perils that accompanied 17th century life. Giunti's biography of Cardinal Ludovisi ends with the cardinal's death, his autopsy and embalmment, a mass held for him at San Petronio in Bologna, and his burial in San Ignazio. There are numerous other exciting, evocative, and revealing episodes than those that I've been able to mention here. I didn't want to spoil everything, after all. But overall, my takeaway from the biography is that it shows him to be a charitable and dutiful man. Yes, like all biographies, it is not without its hyperbole or emphasis. And surely there is a degree of bias on the part of the author with regard to his subject. Nevertheless, what we have with Giunti's text is a fairly straightforward, first-hand account of the cardinal. And I have no doubt that it will help us to further illuminate and better understand the cardinal and his family, aspects of daily and ceremonial life in the Italian peninsula, as well as the industry of biography writing and the goals of an amanuensis. All that content that I have just summarized, the attitudes, activities, and acquaintances of the cardinal, were all nearly inaccessible to my students at work transcribing the biography. None of these students speak Italian, and for many this was their first time working on a handwritten, cursive, 17th century script. So what I'd like to talk about now is the process of transcription, its outcomes, and its possible future directions. Giunti's biography is about 250 pages long, if you count the retro and verso sides of the pages. So with the help of Dr. Brennan, the very first step we took was to divide the biography into manageable sections for a class of 18 students. This meant that each student received about 10 pages of text to transcribe. The primary goal of the project was to render the handwritten text in typewritten script. So early on in the spring semester, we had a norming session with Dr. Brennan, in which he introduced the class to the cardinal and to the origins of the biography. We also discussed the cursive of the text and helped students to do some basic deciphering with the model. Dr. Brennan created a short PowerPoint slide, which I made accessible to students that showed various samples of text and allowed students to see how transcription worked. After that, students were left to labor on their transcription for some weeks. Then I had students submit the first 2 pages of their work so that I could proofread and provide assistance on any difficult but repeated issues with letters, words, or phrases. Some examples of difficult passages are shown here. The shorthand form of per and the abbreviations of titles such as Signore, Cardinale, and Sua Eminenza are other examples. With this in hand, students could move forward and continue transcribing, aware of Giunti's shorthand for these words and phrases. About a month later, and despite the disruption caused by the pandemic, students submitted their transcription alongside a 1-page reflection paper on the assignment. For this reflection, students were asked to answer the following questions. How do transcriptions like this help researchers? What challenges did you experience in transcribing the text? And how did you overcome those challenges? To these questions, I received numerous insightful responses. Generally speaking, students saw the value of their work and were excited to be laboring on something that was authentic and primary. They compared their work to the textual equivalent of that famed archaeologist of the Gilded Screen, Indiana Jones. They also recognized that their work was instrumental in making the text more accessible to researchers via a digital, typewritten copy. Several students commented on the challenges that they met with regard to the handwriting and the language barrier. For many, the struggles with the tight, cursive text of the author was overcome through sheer perseverance. Some students noted that the more they worked on the assignment, the better they got at deciphering the letters of the text. Furthermore, many students developed clever strategies for coping with the challenges that they faced. They developed alphabet keys or guides for each letter so that they could reference a difficult symbol in the text against the alphabet that they had already deciphered. I know some students even pooled resources, sharing their keys, asking for help with difficult sections, and using the collective wisdom of their peers to help them work on their section. Many students employed Google Translate to make sure they had something legible for their transcribed version, and to make slight adjustments to their transcription to see if another letter would work to complete a word. A handful of students recognized challenges presented in the text in its orthography, with some words spelled differently throughout, and naturally, for a handwritten text, the author's own mistakes and idiosyncrasies. Perhaps the biggest challenge was the handwriting, which sometimes became rushed or compacted towards the bottom of the page or center margin, or was less legible because of the bleeding through of the previous page's text. These strategies were largely invented by individual students to overcome the challenges presented by the project. They demonstrate clever techniques that are often employed by experts. Because scholars often need considerable time to study any one era's paleography, I must congratulate our students on such a commendable bit of work. But what I think is quite important with this type of authentic assignment is to recognize that it also creates authentic solutions. Our students mustered courage and channeled grit to return back page after page to a project that was demanding and, at least at first, a little bit unwieldy. Our students learned much about the Ludovisi through our preliminary discussions, but they also learned a process for dealing with something that is challenging, with both its reward in tackling that challenge and the awareness of natural setbacks along the path. Overall, students were pleased with completing such an engaging project in an art history class. The digitization of the biography allowed them access to the archival world from afar and has, for some, opened up the possibility of that type of work after graduation. And while there certainly were students who struggled with the project, they saw the value in the contribution that they were making to the scholarly world. If I can speak on behalf of my class, I think they would be delighted, and of course some of them are here with us today, that a project they worked on in class will have ramifications in the real world. One student even reported that this was their favorite art history project because of the hands-on quality of the work that they were up to. As this was my first time assigning a transcription project, there are certainly things that I would adjust were I to do it again. In addition to posting samples and having an introductory session with students, in a future iteration of this assignment, I would build a full workshop day into the semester so that students can start in the classroom and have an opportunity to ask questions or work together. I would also construct an online community space around the project where students could more easily share questions with each other. We actually did this in our learning management system in the form of discussion boards, but it wasn't used very much. So I think making it a bit easier to access and employ would make it a more helpful resource. We now find ourselves in the phase of moving forward from this exciting contribution to 17th century studies. During our last day of spring classes, we had a virtual visit with the Princes and with Dr. Brennan, which allowed students to see the value and the appreciation for their work firsthand. Now, the next steps will be to continue to edit the transcription and to compare it against the other copies of the biography in the Corsini and Vatican libraries, which I haven't yet had the opportunity to do. From there, an authoritative and comprehensive volume can be published that compiles all of the biographies together, which could be made available to researchers and enthusiasts alike for years to come. I believe that there is much to be learned from this document, much more that remains to be studied. And I'm thrilled by all of the possibilities for scholars of many different disciplines that the biography and this copy of it represents. Thank you.